In our last lesson, we talked about the chromatic style of Bela Bartok. In this video, we'll look at the modal aspect of his style in the fourth movement of his music for strings, percussion, and cellist. Once again, due to copyright restrictions, I can't quote the music here, so please listen to the movement before and after this lesson. Unlike the first movement, where the chromatic harmony appeared in a fugue, here the textures are more homophonic and the language is more diatonic and modal. In fact, one interesting aspect of this movement is the way the same ideas are developed in a variety of textures. Bartok himself did years of research into folk music of Eastern European countries, and his own music reflects this, especially in movements like this one. Before we look at it in more detail, one nice touch. In measure 209 to 215, Bartok brings back the first movement theme, but now in this mode. Here's the original version of the theme as it appears at the start of the first movement. Now here's the modal version. Now let's start from the beginning of the movement. The movement begins with an arpeggiated A major 6/4 chord for 4 bars. Then the main theme arrives in A Lydian. Here it is. The use of the 6/4 chord here is typical of composers who refer to classical vocabulary, but in novel ways. It's stable enough to provide a sense of focus, but not as static and as immobile as the root position tonic chord. Starting in measure 9, the theme is reprised in a richer texture, but now the last note is F sharp in measure 13. The cadence begins in the bar before, as the bass finally leaves E, going down to D and then C sharp. Interestingly, the cadential harmony is not a triad, but a chord built in fourths. But the only change to A Lydian is the D natural of the bass in measure 13. So this whole first presentation is almost all diatonic with just that one alteration. Now a new variant of the theme arrives with the 16th note upbeat. For the first time, the accompaniment here provides some chromaticism in measure 15 in the middle parts. The texture is also more imitative, as this new variant appears in various instruments. We could describe this passage as a modulating sequence, although not between classical keys. By its third repetition, the ending is modified to outline a diminished chord in measure 19. After some more imitation, the harmony moves to a C7 chord in octaves. It's spelled like a dominant of F major, although that key is nowhere clearly implied. So the static harmony of the opening has now become more mobile. The harmonic rhythm has accelerated. What follows in measure 26 is the equivalent of a deceptive cadence as the timpani begin a new ostinato centered on D flat and A flat. Now a new texture arrives, once again harmonically rather static over a G sharp or A flat pedal, while the timpani continue with their A flat D flat double pedal. Here the two string orchestras move in parallel consonant triadic harmonies from measure 27 to 34. Note, however, the piano, which starts off with a C sharp pedal, starts playing a contrapuntal line in measure 30 as a separate layer. Then in measure 35, the parallel harmony starts to dissolve. The chords are no longer all triads. On the second beat of this bar, there's a sort of neighbor chord, very dissonant. It repeats several times, alternating with the triads, and reaches a peak in measure 41-43. The top note is now G, progressing from the previous F, which leads to A, where the opening material returns, in measure 44. Now the top line is harmonized with parallel 6/3 chords. So each individual line is Lydian, but the overall result is more complex, since the parallel chords are chromatically exact, instead of being absorbed by the Lydian mode of the top line. And underneath in the bass, there's a counterpoint of little fragments. It's also a Lydian mode, but with F sharp as the center. Measure 52, both parts converge and allow unison B flat, allowing the texture to breathe. This is followed by some more dissonant neighbor chords over the B flat. The counterpoint gets denser in measure 54 and following, then returns to the B flat in measure 58. The neighbor note chords return, but this time they lead to E flat in measure 62. Then they start again in measure 63-64. Here again, the counterpoint gets more complex and then arrives at A flat in measure 70, where the same process finally leads to a variant of the main theme, first in the piano and then answered in the strings in measure 74. Note that during this final build-up, before rehearsal B, the A flat continues to sound sustained. This makes the texture richer. When the main theme recurs at rehearsal B, it is F sharp natural minor, accompanied by sustained chords in the strings, alternating between F sharp minor 6/4 chord and a neighbor chord where the middle note changes to G natural. When the strings answer in measure 78, the piano interjects with more and more dissonant chords over the pedal C sharp. At measure 82/3, the bass rises to D and then to E flat in measure 83. Now the main line is in E flat Dorian mode, which then in measure 90 becomes E flat Mixolydian. All this takes place again over the pedal B flat. Then in measure 96, the bass descends to D flat and A flat, and then G and C. But the main line above continues with the same scalar material, changing modes from time to time. For example, by measure 100, it is in Locrian mode, but covered with a C flat at the top of the line. As we can see, in general in this movement, the main material is modal, alternating between relatively static harmony and more active and dissonant passages. This harmonic variety is essential to the overall form. This is a perfect example of how Bartok combined principles taken from Western art music with ideas inspired by folk music. While the bass line has a sense of direction, typical of traditional harmony, the chords above are not functional in the way classical tonality is. There's no dominant or predominant harmony. But voice leading, as always, allows the listener to understand where the music is coming from and where it's going. This is because voice leading comes from how we hear. It's not limited to Western art music. For example, at the final cadence of this movement, in measure 283-5, the bass line goes down from D sharp through C sharp and B to the tonic A. But the chords above are not at all a standard tonal cadence. But that final A chord is nonetheless in root position. Bartok's music shows how exploring new harmonic worlds is possible as long as they make sense in terms of human perception. For example, by limiting the vocabulary and then varying it, by letting the music breathe with various degrees of dissonance and varying harmonic rhythm, by respecting the principles of voice leading. This is one reason his music is often much more appealing to average music lovers than more rigid tonal works of Schoenberg and his followers.